So fellas, considering how disappointing UFC 312 was and the fact that we've only got one pay-per-view announced up and coming, I thought I'd do a bit of UFC card building for UFC 315, which are going to be in Canada, UFC Brazil in a fight night, and then UFC 317, which recently has been announced to be a pay-per-view on International Fight Week, which is going to be quite a big card. And we've started off with UFC 315. Now, if you look at all the potential champions who could headline this card, I've erased a few of them due to recency and the fact that they're going to be fighting recently. I've also erased Alex Pereira, considering he's obviously fighting at UFC 313. I'm also going to erase Pantoja because he's fighting at 314. I'm also going to erase John Jones. He's not headlining in Canada. So it's between Topuria and Bilal Muhammad. And I'm going to do Bilal Muhammad headlining this 315 card. And even though at first Bilal Muhammad headlining a pay-per-view might be quite disappointing, it's against Shavkat Rakhmonov. Bilal Muhammad, Shavkat Rakhmonov to headline the Canadian card at UFC 315. I mean, there's no other top Canadian fighters who could potentially headline this card. And you know what? This isn't even that bad of a title fight. It was supposed to be for UFC 310. Since that, obviously, Ian Gary stepped in on a short notice. Shavkat's got another win over Ian Gary. People calling him overrated, but in my opinion, the fact that he did have a close fight with Ian Gary actually makes this fight more interesting, because before, people were kind of disrespecting Bilal, saying that Shavkat's going to run him over, and now that he's had that close fight with Ian Gary, he's still 19-0 with 18 finishes. But it's a really good fight. You know, two heavy grapplers, two guys that seem to be pretty much unstoppable right now in the UFC. Bilal Muhammad for the undisputed welterweight belt, taking on Shavkat Rakhmonov to headline UFC 315 in Canada. It's not that bad of a title fight. You know what? I'm looking forward to this more than I was for the Leon Edwards fight, because Leon and Bilal Muhammad are like two decision machines going at it. But at least Shavkat's got some sort of finishing ability. So Bilal, Shavkat to headline UFC 315. But you know what? Because it's in Canada and Canada usually gets done dirty, I'm going to give them two title fights. Now, the next title fight I'm going to give them is going to be Juliana Pena versus Kayla Harrison. Listen, I know Juliana Pena and Bilal Muhammad, you know, both of them headlining a pay-per-view might be quite disappointing for Canada, but listen, they've been given two title fights, and I don't even mind Kayla Harrison versus Juliana Pena. Kayla Harrison, she's definitely earned a title shot now. She's probably one of the most intriguing contenders in women MMA, and I know there's rumors about Amanda Nunes coming back and fighting Juliana Pena a third time. It's not happening. As good as that would be, it's not happening. She's been gone for 2 years. Let's see Kayla Harrison get a shot at Juliana Pena, and to be fair, Juliana Pena didn't really deserve to get that win over Raquel Pennington anyway. I thought, you know, fair enough that Kayla Harrison should be the one that getting the next title shot. So potentially Kayla Harrison is the most dominant performance yet against Juliana Pena for the undisputed bantamweight belt. 5 rounds. Listen, this title fight has to take place somewhere. Let's give Canada two title fights. Juliana Pena, Kayla Harrison. At least Kayla Harrison's one of the more interesting women MMA fighters. But considering that we have had Bilal Muhammad and Juliana Pena headline the card so far, I thought we'd treat Canada to a good fight for the featured fight. So for the featured fight on this UFC 315 card, I've gone with Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan number 2. Another 5-round fight. I'm not sure the UFC would do 3 5-round fights. They did it at UFC 300, and obviously this is a different circumstance, but this fight needs to happen across 5 rounds. 3 rounds ain't enough for these guys. They're both champion level, so I think it's got to happen. Obviously, we're supposed to see Arman Tsarukyan get a title shot against Makhachev. Ended up pulling out on last minute. Dana White's been going mad in the press conferences saying that it's going to be like a year until Tsarukyan gets the next title shot. Oliveira's coming off a really good win over Michael Chandler. The first fight was very close. And last time Oliveira fought in Canada, he brutalized Benil Dariush in the first round. So I don't mind Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan number 2 for a number 1 contender fight. While maybe you do Topuria versus Makhachev and make this for an interim... No, they're not going to do 3 title fights. But maybe if, you know, Topuria versus Makhachev's in the summer to determine who fights for the belt next. Tsarukyan, Oliveira, 5 rounds in Canada. A number 1 contender fight for the featured fight to give the Canadian fans 3 5-round fights on one card. I think this would be a really good fight. You can't complain about it at all. One of the best fights you can make in the UFC right now, as we saw in the first fight. Now, for the next fight down on the card, let's look at an Oliveira teammate. Who would be great at supporting Charles Oliveira? It's going to be Ian Gary, a former still a teammate of Charles Oliveira. He's obviously trains at Shooter Box with Charles Oliveira. And considering that you've got Bilal Muhammad and Shavkat headlining the card in the welterweight division, maybe putting Ian Gary on the card could spice it up a little bit, another welterweight showdown. And I'm going to do Ian Gary versus Sean Brady. I think Sean Brady is actually quite an underrated welterweight right now. Obviously, Sean Brady, he's lost to Bilal Muhammad before. But apart from that, he's been beating everyone, and that's his only loss in MMA. And he's just beat Gilbert Burns, who's a training partner of Ian Gary as well. I think this makes a lot of sense. Ian Gary versus Sean Brady for not necessarily a number 1 contender fight, because that's what Gary versus Shavkat was. But maybe the winner of this fight can then go into a number 1 contender fight after this. I think this is a really fun fight. 17-1 versus 15-1. One's lost to Bilal, one's lost to Shavkat. 2 guys who are around that top 5 area in the welterweight division. They need to bounce back. Brady, Ian Gary, grappler versus a striker. I think this is a really good fight, and I think this should be next for both of them. to enter title contention. For the 4th fight down in Canada, Ian Gary's on the same card of Oliveira. Sean Brady's getting a big opportunity. Ian Gary, Sean Brady, 4th fight down. Now, so far on the card, we've had 4 pretty good fights, in my opinion, or at least a couple of good fights, but we haven't had any Canadians so far to, be on a Canadian main card. So I think we've got to put at least 1 Canadian fighter on it. So I'm going to do Rose Namajunas versus Jasmine Judavicius. Jasmine Judavicius, listen, I know people are going to complain because it's 2 women MMA fights on 1 card or whatever, but this isn't that bad of a fight. Jasmine Judavicius, apart from losing to Tracy Cortez, has been looking really good in the past couple of fights. Just dominantly beat Mara Bueno Silva. Rose Namajunas has been losing the vast majority of her recent fights. She needs to step down. It makes sense from a rankings perspective. Number 9 fighting up, number 6 fighting down. I think this makes a lot of sense on a Canadian main card to get Jasmine Judavicius, and I'm going to go out there and say that Jasmine Judavicius is probably Canada's best chance at another champion. She's a really good grappler. Her stand-up does need to be sharpened up a bit, and I would probably favour Rose Namajunas to win this fight, but listen, let's give Canada one of their better fighters right now. Judavicius on the main card, taking on former champion Rose Namajunas to open up the main card of UFC 315, and this is already one of the best main card Canada's ever had. If you look at historically the past couple of fight nights and pay-per-views we've had in Canada, they've all been awful, so I feel like this so far hasn't been that bad. Now, some potential prelims that you can stick on the Canadian card. We've got to fill this up with Canadian fighters. The first prelim I'm going to do is Ayman Zahabi versus Marcus McGee. I think this is a really good prelim. You've got to have Ayman Zahabi on the Canadian card. He's from Canada himself, obviously. I think this just makes sense. 2 guys on the come up in the bantamweight division. Ayman Zahabi's been in a bit of a roll recently. 5-fight winning streak in the UFC, and Marcus McGee's undefeated in the UFC with 4 wins, 3 stoppages. Just beat Jonathan Martinez. They're both ranked in the bantamweight division. They're both up-and-comers. You want to have Ayman Zahabi in a Canadian card. Let him headline the prelim. Again, one of probably the second best Canadian right now in Ayman Zahabi, taking on Marcus McGee, a guy who's got good finishing ability and recently showed that he's got good technique. The winner can get a top 10 fight, maybe even like somebody in the top 7. I think that makes sense to push Ayman Zahabi in front of Canada. The next fight I will do is another former Canadian prospect, Charles Jourdain, taking on Jonathan Martinez. This is a really good fight in the bantamweight division as well, in my opinion. And again, another Canadian in Charles Jourdain. Charles Jourdain, he had a bit of an up and down run in the featherweight division, but he recently moved down to bantamweight, and he looks like he's found his home in the bantamweight division. Looked better than he ever has before. Jonathan Martinez was on a tear, was ranked, then now on a 2-fight losing streak to Aldo and McGee. Hasn't been looking so good recently. He's no longer ranked, and I feel like this is a good fight. If Jonathan Martinez can beat Charles Jourdain, he's bounced back against a pretty fun striker and a guy with good jiu-jitsu, and potentially from there we can see Martinez against another ranked fighter. And if Charles Jourdain can beat Jonathan Martinez, that's probably his biggest win yet, considering the circumstances. And then we can see Charles Jourdain fight somebody in the top 15 of the bantamweight division. So I think this is another good chance to get Charles Jourdain in front of Canada. Put him against Jonathan Martinez as the core featured prelim. Next up on the card, I'm going to have one of the most embarrassing performances from a prospect, coming back with Mike Mallet taking on Li Jingliang. Yeah, I want to see Mike Mallet take someone on like Li Jingliang. I think this could be a good pay-per-view prelim fight. Obviously, again, Mike Mallet from Canada. Was once a massive Canadian prospect. People were saying he's going to be the next big thing, and then he ends up getting throat checked by Neil Magny of all people, but he did pull off a pretty uneventful win in his most recent fight. He's coming off a win, and I think we give him a bit of a step up against Li Jingliang. You can't disrespect a card with Li Jingliang. I know he's extremely inactive and he's been losing the vast majority of his recent fights, but in fairness to Li Jingliang, he should have beaten Daniel Rodriguez. He hits pretty hard, and I actually think he's definitely got the capability to beat Mike Mallet. So if Mike Mallet wants to get a good win in Canada, him versus a well-known and respected fighter in Li Jingliang, I think makes sense to put on the prelims. And then the first fight to kick off the main prelims, I think, should be Jillian Robertson versus Marina Rodriguez. Jillian Robertson, I know I said that about Jasmine Judavicius being the best chance of a champion, but Canadians Jillian Robertson, she's been looking amazing recently as Robertson. Now, this fight has been announced, but they've announced it for the week before. I'm pretty sure this has been announced a week before the potential UFC 315 Canadian card, which doesn't make any sense to me, considering that Jillian Robertson's one of the best Canadian fighters right now. She's been in a complete role, one of the best grapplers in women MMA right now, taking on Marina Rodriguez, who's not really doing anything with her career. He's kind of just sat there in the rankings. I think that makes sense, and I think that's a pretty good prelim for Canada. 4 Canadian fighters, 4 of the best, if anything. And then if we just skim over a few early prelims, Marc-Andre Barriault versus Trezean Gore. Barry Holt's a pretty shit Canadian, but have him on the card and put him against Dana White Contender Series turned successful fighter Trezin Gore. You could also have maybe Kyle Nelson versus Alex Caceres. I think this would be an absolute banger from a striking perspective, so stick that on Canada's card. Brad Katona versus a Begzat Almakar. Now, if you don't know who Begzat Almakar is, he was the guy who actually had a really good, not a really good performance, but actually dropped Umar Nurmagomedov on short notice last year. Hasn't been out since, and this is his comeback fight against Brad Katona, who's obviously from Canada, won the Ultimate Fighter. And then to maybe kick off, you can have Sergey City taking on Cameron Smotherman, a Canadian guy taking on a Dana White Contender Series prospect, and that fight has also been announced for the week before the Canadian pay-per-view, which again doesn't really make any sense, but that would be our Canadian card. I think that's a pretty good card. You've got a lot of Canadians on the prelims, you've got one on the main card, and it's a pretty good main card. 3 5-round fights, 2 title fights. If you're a Canadian fan, with what you've been given recently, you can't complain with that card. So that is my UFC 315 card for Canada. Now, if we move on to the next card, which is going to be UFC 317, this is going to be a big card, because this is going to be International Fight Week, which the UFC historically tend to kind of stack. They tried doing McGregor versus Chandler last year. Before that, it was UFC 290, which was stacked as shit. Before that, it was UFC 276, which, if you look at it on paper, is one of the most stacked cards we've ever been given. So we have to make this a big card. Now, what's the biggest fight in MMA right now you can do on this card? And I think the answer to that question is already known. Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. If we're going to see this fight, I don't think there's a better card to do it on internet than International Fight Week. The fight that everybody's been waiting for. The biggest fight in mixed martial arts right now, if you take away maybe like Conor McGregor, but even then, who wants to see McGregor nowadays over this? This is the fight everyone wants to see. The only guy who has the capability to beat Jon Jones, the best heavyweight in the world versus the greatest of all time. I don't need to, tell you an essay about why this is a great fight. It's been told a million times already, and it has to happen now. It's past its, we need to see this sooner than later. Tom Aspinall versus Jon Jones, the fight everyone wants to see. 5 rounds for the undisputed heavyweight belt, the greatest of all time versus the best in the world right now. This has to happen, and whatever card this is going to be on, it's going to be a massive card, because like I said, it's the biggest title fight you can make in the UFC right now. Stick it on International Fight Week, make it a good event for Jon Jones, potential retirement fight, but if we are going to see Jon Jones compete, it has to be against Tom Aspinall. Let's do it for UFC 317 in June. That way you can maybe potentially fit, if Tom Aspinall does beat Jon Jones, you could potentially fit another fight towards the end of the year for Tom Aspinall, so he's not just fighting on average once a year. And for Jon Jones, if he can beat Tom Aspinall, successful retirement, retire happily on International Fight Week. And if he wants to stick around, Jon Jones versus maybe Alex Pereira towards the end of 2025 in November, where he usually tends to fight. Jones, Aspinall, International Fight Week. Let's have it headline. And I said this is going to be a big card. And there's been a guy going around saying he's going to retire recently with Dustin Poirier, saying he wants to have a nice standing and banging retirement fight. And I think the best fight you can do for Dustin Poirier right now is Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway. 5 rounds for the BMF belt. Listen, I know I'm kind of sick of these guys fighting each other. Gaethje, Chandler, Poirier, Oliveira. It's become a bit boring since 2022. Not as if the fights are boring, but the same opponents going against each other. But this is one that I'm not going to be bored about. Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway to co-main event this pay-per-view for the BMF belt. I mean, every single time these guys go out there, it's a banger. They both started off 2024 with a bang. Poirier knocking out Benoit Saint-Denis. Holloway getting knockout of the century contender against Justin Gaethje. And then they suffered losses. Poirier got put to sleep by Makhachev. Holloway got put to sleep by Ilia Topuria, and this is their bounce back fight. They're both 1-1 with both stoppages in 2024. They fought each other 2 times before, but it was ages ago, and obviously they weren't in their prime. Well, I'd say they weren't in their prime then. Poirier versus Holloway, let's run it back. You know what it's going to be. You know it's going to be an absolute banger of a fight between one of the best boxers in the UFC and one of the best boxers in the UFC. Again, potential retirement fight for Dustin Poirier. What's a better retirement fight than Mr. Max Holloway? I think this is a complete banger. You already know this isn't going to go the distance, and if it does, it's going to be 5 rounds of pure violence. One of the most violent fights you can make in the UFC for the BMF belt co-main event. That is my UFC 317 co-main event. And then for the featured fight, I think Michael Chandler, he's been saying he wants to slot on this card, and imagine the press conference. You know that Dustin Poirier absolutely hates Michael Chandler. Spice it up a bit, put Michael Chandler in the mix, get him on the featured fight. So let's stick Michael Chandler on this card, and I'm going to put him against Paddy Pimblett on this card. This has been a fight that's been going around recently. There were rumors of this fight taking place on UFC International Fight Week. Michael Chandler has actually kind of been hinting about it. He's been tweeting on Twitter recently about potential fight between him and Paddy on International Fight Week. It seems like that's the fight that he wants kind of next. So Chandler versus Paddy Pimblett, International Fight Week, another lightweight fight, 3 rounds. in lightweight division. This is going to go one of two ways. Michael Chandler's going to knock and beat the brakes off of Paddy Pimblett and absolutely throat check him, or Paddy Pimblett's going to somehow get the win over Michael Chandler, probably beat him in a goofy way, and capitalize on Chandler's terrible fight IQ. Also makes sense, you know, you've got Tom Aspinall from England, you want to get that UK-based tapped in, get Paddy Pimblett on the card, you've already got two of the biggest British mixed martial artists on it already. Paddy Pimblett, Michael Chandler, International Fight Week, featured fight. I think this is fair for Chandler. We're not giving him a top contender that he hasn't deserved. We're giving him somebody, you know, ranked down, but it's also a massive opportunity for Paddy Pimblett to make a name off of a former title challenger in Michael Chandler, because if Pimblett can beat Chandler, that's by far his biggest win yet. He's going to be in the top 10 of the lightweight division, which everyone said he could never do. But you've also got Chandler, an opportunity to bounce back on International Fight Week against an up-and-coming guy with a bit of hype. So Chandler, Pimblett for the featured fight. And like I said before, we've got two British guys on the card. Let's make it three. Michael Venom Page just got a massive win over Sharapati Magomedov, taking away his oar. Let's see the fight that I think everyone kind of wants to see. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus MVP. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say this is going to be a back and forth banger like, you know, a Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway. There is a slight chance this could turn into a boring fight, but there's also a chance this could be one of the best striking spectacles we've seen in the UFC. MVP, without a doubt, one of the best strikers in the UFC. So difficult to figure out. And Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, his karate and just his MMA resume when it comes to striking is pretty much uncompared to. So Stephen Wonderboy Thompson versus MVP as the fourth fight down on this card. Three British fighters on the main card. Striker versus a striker. International Fight Week. There's no better place to put this card. To be fair, I kind of want to see this for 5 rounds and like a fight night main event, but this is a banger of a card. It makes sense for Stephen Wonderboy Thompson as well because he got knocked out by Buckley. This gives him more than enough time to recover. And MVP's obviously just fought at UFC Saudi Arabia. By the time UFC 317 comes around, he's going to be fine. So Stephen Thompson, MVP, 3 rounds in the welterweight division. Step up for MVP, step down for Thompson. Makes a lot of sense. Now, if you look at the past 2 John Jones cards, there's been a certain guy who's been on both of the main cards and seems to be on every John Jones card, and that's Mr. Bo Nickel. I think we get Bo Nickel on this card too to open up the main card now. I think we've gone past the point of complaining about Bo Nickel being on the main card. Yes, he just had a really boring fight with Paul Craig, but he's racked up a couple of wins in the UFC. He's now actually ranked in the middleweight division, and I think the perfect fight is Bo Nickel versus Michel Pereira. I think this is the perfect fight for Bo Nickel from, well, just every perspective next. I mean, Michel Pereira is Bo's biggest test by far. To go from Paul Craig to Michel Pereira is a huge step up, but at the same time, I also think Michel Pereira is stylistically easy. Michel Pereira is experienced, he's got decent jiu-jitsu, and he's got very good striking. He likes to have a bit of, you know, a bit of fun in the octagon when he's striking as well as a bit of a fan favorite, but his grappling and his stamina is completely awful. He just got mauled by Hernandez, which I think a wrestler in Bo Nickel could capitalize on, and on top of that, Bo Nickel's number 15th, Michel Pereira's 13th. It makes sense from a rankings perspective. There are people who argue Bo Nickel shouldn't be ranked. Well, let's see him against a ranked fighter in Michel Pereira. I think this just makes a lot of sense. Bo Nickel taking on Michel Pereira. You could either see Bo Nickel go out there and out-wrestle Michel Pereira, get a win against a ranked fighter, prove that he's ranked worthy, and do it on the main card of a pay-per-view, because I feel like the UFC are not going to put Bo Nickel on the prelims anymore, considering the fact that every time you put him on a main card, he wins. Against Michel Pereira, who likes to spice up fights, make it a little bit fun, I think that makes sense for the main card opener. Now, if we look at some potential prelims, the first prelim, Alexa Grasso versus Erin Blanchfield. Now, knowing the UFC, they're probably going to do this as a fight night main event. Erin Blanchfield versus Alexa Grasso is one of the few women MMA fights that I'm actually interested to see. You've got Alexa Grasso, who just lost in a title fight to Valentina Shevchenko, against Erin Blanchfield, who just beat Rose Namajunas, and is probably a fight away from a title shot. Number 1 versus number 3, step down for Grasso, step up for Blanchfield. I think that makes all the sense in the world. Erin Blanchfield versus Alexa Grasso. You can market this as a number 1 contender fight. Obviously, you've got Manon Fiorot taking on Shevchenko next, or maybe you've got Zhang Weili taking on Shevchenko next, whatever's going on with that. So behind the scenes, you can maybe do a bit of a number 1 contender fight, or at least a backup for a title fight with Alexa Grasso taking on Erin Blanchfield, which I think is a really good fight from a clash of styles. 2 heavy grapplers with decent stand-up. Well, I say heavy grapplers, Grasso's more of a boxer, but yeah, good fight, good way to headline the prelims. And next up on the card, Dan Ige versus Felipe Lima. I think Dan Ige versus Felipe Lima is a fight that I've been wanting to see for a while now. You've got to have Dan Ige on a big card, you know, 50k Dan Ige. Never really disappoints in any of his fights, but he does lose the majority of his fights. If you look at Dan Ige against ranked opponents, he's lost to so many ranked opponents now. I think we've got to let him welcome in somebody else into the rankings, and I feel like Felipe Lima is that guy. Felipe Lima is a good prospect right now in the bantamweight division, former Octagon champion, 2-0 in the the UFC so far with 2 impressive performances, and the UFC like to put prospects on big cards like a John Jones card, like an International Fight Week card, and let's have Felipe Lima get the world watching him, potentially beating Dan Ige, getting into the rankings. Or if Dan Ige is going to win, it's probably going to be in flatlining Felipe Lima, which just makes for a great highlight reel. Next up on the card, the UFC always like to put a couple of veterans on big cards like this. So let's have Rafael dos Santos versus Neo Magny, 2 veterans competing on the John Jones International Fight Week card. Now, they have fought before way back in 2017, and dos Santos submitted him, but that was absolutely ages ago now. Let's see him. Let's see him again. UFC debut for Rafael dos Santos was all the way back in 2008. UFC debut for Magny was 2013. They're both veterans. They're both in a similar position where they're not good enough to face any of the ranked opposition. They've been losing a lot of fights recently, but I actually wouldn't know who to pick in this fight. I could see them both winning. It's a fair fight, 2 veterans. Put it on the prelims of an International Fight Week card. I think that's a really good fight to put on, and it makes sense. And then for the next fight down on the prelims, Zhang Mingyang versus Justin Jacoby. We said before, the UFC like to put prospects and veterans on an International Fight Week card, and one of the biggest prospects in the light heavyweight division is Zhang Mingyang. He's 18-0. Every single one of his wins come by way of stoppage. Every single one of his knockouts are in the first round. He's 3-0 in the UFC with 3 knockouts right now. He just brutally knocked out Ozzy Diaz. He's on a complete tear in the light heavyweight division. And Dustin Jacoby just got a really good knockout over Vitor Petrino. If you put this for 3 rounds, I do not see how this goes the distance. It's either going to be Zhang Mingyang making a name for himself on a big card, knocking out Dustin Jacoby, making it into the rankings, or it's going to be Dustin Jacoby getting another highlight reel knockout over Zhang Mingyang, shutting down the prospect and getting a big win. I think that's a great set of prelims. And then for some early prelims you can maybe go through, I think Jared Gordon versus Jim Miller. You've got to have Jim Miller on International Fight Week. On a John Jones card, stick Jim Miller on there. He looked really good in his last fight against Jared Gordon, which I think is a fair step up. Not too big of a step up in competition, but it's a fair step up. Get Jim Miller on the card. Talishin Teixeira versus Dontel Mayes. Talishin Teixeira is probably heavyweight's biggest prospect right now. I say we give him Dontel Mayes. It's an easy fight for him to get him into the top 15 of the heavyweight division, to get some eyes on him in the UFC. Talishin Teixeira versus Dontel Mayes. Next fight up, or down on the card, Jacoby Smith versus Francisco Prado. Jacoby Smith may not be classed as a prospect yet, but let me tell you something about this guy. He has potential to be one of the best up-and-coming welterweights we've ever seen. This guy is so talented. He's good. He's amazing everywhere the fight goes. And I think we use Francisco Prado, who's, I think, 1-3 in the UFC, to build a name for Jacoby Smith. Get Jacoby Smith a highlight reel over Francisco Prado. And to kick off the card, maybe like Navajo Sterling versus Marcin Prachnio. Navajo Sterling was meant to be a prospect. He trains at Adesanya's gym. He was this big kickboxer, just beat Tuco Tacos at UFC. I forgot which card it was, but it was quite recently. Let's see him gets to step up in somebody like Marcin Prachnio to build a name for himself. I think that's a good set of early prelims. But either way, UFC 317 did not disappoint. This could be like the UFC 300 of 2025. I know it's not as stacked, but, you know, 2 title fights. Poirier Holloway, Jones Aspinall, Pimlet Chandler, MVP versus Thompson, and then the prelims that I just went through. I think this is a really, really stacked card, potentially the most stacked of the year for International Fight Week. And then for the fight night that I'm going to do in Brazil. Now, I don't know if the UFC are going to do a pay-per-view in Brazil this year, because Porton's booked against Dan Kalaev, Pantoja's booked against Cara France. So maybe if they do it in like June, they could pull it off. But assuming that they do a fight night in here, which they have done before, I think a perfect fight night headliner for Brazil could be Corey Sandhagen versus Davison Figueiredo. You know what? I don't care if this is in Brazil. I don't care if this is in front of any place. You know what? I don't even give a shit if this is in front of the Apex. This is one of the fights I want to see right now more than any fight in the UFC. You've got Corey Sandhagen, who's one of the highest level fighters in the bantamweight division. Elite striking, one of the best in the UFC from a skills perspective, against Davison Figueiredo, former flyweight champion, who has moved up to the bantamweight division, and even though we just lost to Yan, he's had an incredibly successful career so far. You know, he's just lost to Pete Yan. Sandhagen's just lost to Uman Magomedov. They both want to bounce back. They're both top 5. They're both some of the highest level, most skilled fighters in the UFC right now. To headline a fight night in Brazil for Figueiredo, Figgy versus Corey Sandhagen. I really do hope we see this fight one day. I know there's rumors of a Sandhagen versus an O'Malley, or a Figueiredo versus an O'Malley, but from just a fight night main event point of view, 5 rounds, Sandhagen Figgy, I really want to see it. Potentially, like, the winner of this fight could get back into title contention too, because they're both very close to title contention. So for Brazil's fight night, Sandhagen, Figge, let's see him headline it, man. And then next up, who's Brazilian's biggest prospect right now? It's probably Carlos Prates. Let's see Carlos Prates on this card. He's now ranked number 13th in the welterweight division, and I think the next step up, which kind of makes sense, is going to be Jeff Neal. I think that's the perfect fight for him next. Co-main event, Jeff Neal versus Carlos Prates. We're really stacking this card for Brazil. If we're not going to have a pay-per-view, let's at least stack the fight night that we do deliver. This would be a really good fight because Carlos Prates, like I said, he's probably the best prospect in Brazil right now. He's absolutely piecing people up on the feet. He's a knockout machine. It seems like whenever he just connects on the feet, he puts people out cold. And I want to see him tested against his toughest test yet in Jeff Neal. Now, even though Jeff Neal, he might not be the most consistent fighter, only a few years ago, he beat the absolute brakes off of Vicente Luque, and without a doubt, he's one of the best boxers right now. Top 3, in my opinion, best boxers in the welterweight division. I think from a striking perspective, this is one of the best fights you could do in the UFC. For a co-main event to either get Jeff Neal a throat-checking victory over Carlos Prates, or for Carlos Prates to get a win over his biggest name yet in Jeff Neal, I think this makes sense, and I think the winner of this fight could easily make it into like the top 6 of the welterweight division. Maybe face somebody like, I don't know, maybe the loser of Leon Edwards and JDM fights the winner of this fight. I don't know, but either way, Jeff Neal Prates, co-main event for this Brazilian fight night. Next down on the card, a Brazilian that I would love to see in Brazil is Johnny Walker. I want to see Johnny Walker compete in Brazil. You know, he's one of Brazil's, I don't want to say he's one of Brazil's best fighters, but he's definitely talented. Last time he fought in Brazil, he finished Paul Craig, and he knows how to get a crowd going. Now, he was scheduled to fight Bogdan Guskov at UFC 311. It ended up getting cancelled. Bogdan Guskov fought Billy Alicana and actually looked really bad in that fight, as he normally does. I'm really not bought on the hype of Bogdan Guskov. I want this fight to be rescheduled. Featured fight, Johnny Walker versus Bogdan Guskov in the light heavyweight division. Now, yeah, this just makes a lot of sense. Rescheduled the fight. Bogdan Guskov hadn't been looking that impressive, and I don't see this going the distance. Bogdan Guskov, even though he doesn't look that impressive, he must hit very hard because he's always able to find the finish in every fight. And if there's a guy that you could find a finish against, it's going to be against Johnny Walker, who has one of the worst chins in the UFC. Or Johnny Walker could get a win over Bogdan Guskov, get back in the winning column in Brazil, do Johnny Walker things. I think this is a perfect featured fight for Johnny Walker in Brazil when he's been kind of getting done dirty recently. Walker, Guskov featured fight. Next down on the card, next fight down on the card I think that makes sense would be Kyler Phillips versus Vinicius Oliveira. Vinicius Oliveira's really been making a name for himself, man. I know I keep talking about Brazilian prospects, but he's definitely one of them. He just recently beat Saidna Magomedov in a really impressive win at UFC Saudi Arabia. He got one of the best knockouts of the year last year in 2024. He's really burst onto the scene and made a name for himself in 2024 and 2025, and I think Kyler Phillips makes sense next. You know, it gets him into the rankings. Kyler Phillips is number 12 in the division, so it gets what's his name, Vinicius Oliveira into the rankings. Kyler Phillips is coming off a loss to Rob Font as well, where he kind of got battered that fight. So Phillips versus Oliveira, high-paced fight in the bantamweight division. A chance for Vinicius Oliveira to make it into the rankings into the bantamweight division. Oliveira's a really fun fighter. He'd make it fun. Kyler Phillips, a chance for him to get another win. I think this is another perfect fight to do in Brazil. Phillips, Oliveira, who says no? Next down on the card for this fight night, I would do Zaleski dos Santos versus Nicolas Dalby. This fight was scheduled, I forgot which card it was. It might have been the Magny Prates card, but it was scheduled last year, ended up getting cancelled. They have fought each other before, but this was way back in like 2016 now. Zaleski dos Santos versus Nicolas Dalby. I like this fight. You know, this would be quite a fun fight in my opinion. Zaleski dos Santos, he's coming off a really good finish over Zachary Scroggin, a basically complete can, but he completely went out there and destroyed him in the first round. And he hasn't been losing in bad performances, Zaleski dos Santos. He's a really good striker, taking on Nicolas Dalby, who was actually a prospect in the welterweight division and arguably got rubbed against Rinat Fagrinov as well. So I think Zaleski dos Santos versus Nicolas Dalby to put on the 5th fight down in Brazil makes a bit of sense. And then for the main card opener in this Brazilian fight night, Yoanderson Brito versus Pat Sabatini. This would be a banger. Now, this has been scheduled, I think, for UFC Vegas. I forgot which card, but it has been scheduled. But I like the fight. The fans like the fight. It makes more sense to put it on the Brazilian fight now because of Yoanderson Brito. And you look at the records as well. Brito has an amazing record. He just recently lost to Gomes. Pat Sabatini's had a bit of a win-loss career recently, but he's also got a great record. It'll be a great fight. They've both choked out Jonathan Pierce before. They've both fought Diego Lopez. Brito beat him. Pat Sabatini lost. I think this makes all the sense. Like I said, it's already been booked, so I don't have to tell you why it makes sense. I just think it was a really good fight for Brito in Brazil. Last time he fought in Brazil, he destroyed Jack Shaw. Pat Sabatini's a fun fighter, very high pace, amazing grappler as well. Probably one of the best unranked grapplers in the featherweight division. Brito, Pat Sabatini to kick off the main card of Brazil, I think makes sense. Now, some potential prelims for this fight night in Brazil. I think one of them could be Raoni Barcelos versus Ricky Simon. Yeah, Raoni Barcelos, he deserves a bit of a step up after beating Peyton Talbot against maybe Ricky Simon. Now, Ricky Simon is on a 3-fight losing streak now. He was ranked, he was a prospect, and now he's no longer. And considering that Barcelos just shut down the prospect of Peyton Talbot, let him headline the prelim in in Brazil against Ricky Simon. That next step up, I think it makes sense. And I think this would be a really fun fight because they're two very heavy grapplers. Barcelos has a heavy grappling game plan. Ricky Simon has like a heavy pressure boxing game plan, but he can definitely grapple. He's got great jiu-jitsu too. I think that'd be a really good clash of styles in Brazil. Then next up on the card, I think Denise Gomez versus Lupita Godinez would kind of make sense. There's not an entire reason why I think this fight should be next. I just think, considering that Denise Gomez, she's got heavy hands, she's on a 2-fight winning streak, and Lupita Godinez is on a 2-fight losing streak. For Denise Gomez in Brazil, her versus a ranked fighter in Lupita Godinez, you've got to have at least one women MMA fight on this card. I think that's the women MMA fight that makes sense. Next down on the card, Marco Tulio versus Cedric Damas. Yeah, this is going to be a great fight as well. Marco Tulio is a training partner of Charles Oliveira from Chute Box. He's been hyped up a lot, and he just got a brutal finish in his UFC debut against Iho Portieria. And I think the next step up could be Cedric Damas, who has had a pretty good start to his UFC career, coming off a win as well. That next big step up for Marco Tulio in Brazil to make a name for himself in front of his home country. I think that's another great fight he could put on UFC Brazil to build a name. And next up on the card is a bit of a weird fight, but it's going to be Kron Gracie versus Luke Riley. I know a lot of people don't want to see Kron Gracie in the UFC anymore, but let him have his moment in Brazil, his last fight in the UFC in Brazil. And if you don't know who Luke Riley is, he's essentially this training partner of Paddy Pimblett. He's probably one of the best, or one of the most hyped up British fighters outside of the UFC. 70% of his wins by knockout, 3 decisions, never lost a fight before. Let him make a name off Kron Gracie in Brazil, which is a big Brazilian name, but an easy fight for him. So those would be the prelims I put in Brazil. I haven't made any early prelims because it's a fight night, and to be quite honest, there's not really any that comes to mind, but that would be the Brazilian fight night. Sandhagen versus Figgy. It's a pretty stacked fight night for Brazil. What more could you really want from a fight night in Brazil? But those would be the 3 cards I make for 2025. 2 pay-per-views, International Fight Week, Canada, and a fight night in Brazil. Let me know your thoughts on these cards, if you like them, if you dislike them, and if I should have added anything else. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.